By the early 1980s, superpower nuclear competition had evolved into a technical duel of detection systems and command networks. Both the United States and the Soviet Union built early warning systems designed to detect incoming nuclear missile attacks before impact. These systems were not passive, they were operational mechanisms embedded within doctrine and command procedures. The guiding doctrine for both sides was launch on warning, low you. The idea that a side should prepare or execute a counterstrike on receipt of credible warning of an incoming attack, not after impact. Low traded certainty for speed. The system assumed that delay would mean loss of retaliatory capability under compressed missile flight times. This assumption was a structural logic of force posture, not individual psychology. In this environment, satellite and radar sensors became central nodes in strategic competition. Early warning radars scanned for missile boosters rising from silos or submarines. Infrared satellites looked for the heat signature of rocket plumes. These sensors fed data into automated architectures designed to present clear attack or no attack pictures to human operators. Neither side assumed perfect data. Both assumed that ambiguous signals should be treated with caution and, if necessary, acted upon quickly. Systems were built with rapid notification pipelines precisely because perceived surprise attack was the greatest feared scenario in a world of MAD. The structural danger here is that these systems operated on proxy indicators, not direct knowledge of enemy intent. Indicators such as simultaneous heat flashes at specific azimuths or rapid increases in radar returns could suggest an ICBM launch, but indicators are inherently ambiguous. Systems reduced ambiguity by feeding multiple sensor streams into interpretive models. But no system could fully verify intent in minutes. This created a category of strategic risk unique to superpower competition. Actors were forced to make readiness decisions under compressed timeframes and incomplete verification. The geopolitical context in 1983 heightened these systemic pressures. Relations between Moscow and Washington were at a low point. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 shattered détente. The U.S. Strategic Defense Initiative announcement in 1983 worsened Soviet threat perception. The downing of Korean Airlines. Flight 007 in September 1983 had already intensified mutual suspicion and elevated alert postures on both sides. NATO's Able Archer exercise later that November illustrated how easily routine operations could resemble real escalation. But even before Able Archer, the strategic environment was one of heightened alert and worst-case expectation. Within the Soviet Union, strategic planners assumed that the West valued surprise and that technological advantages could enable a decapitating strike. This assumption was not idle paranoia. It was derived from analysis of U.S. nuclear doctrine, missile accuracy improvements, and the reduced warning windows of advanced ICBMs and SOLBMs. Soviet observers calculated that a massive first strike could destroy leadership and command nodes before effective retaliation. From this structural outlook, low and heightened early warning readiness were institutionalized as necessary for survival. The logic went, if detection systems cannot reliably discriminate until impact, then command systems must act on indicators, not proof. The United States held similar assumptions about Soviet capabilities, though filtered through different architectures. U.S. early warning systems, including NORAD and Strategic Air Command's detection networks, were oriented toward minimizing false negatives, failing to detect a real attack. In the superpower rivalry, intelligence and warning systems were compete-optimized for fastest plausible detection. This meant that ambiguous signals would often be escalated for human review rather than dismissed. Within this strategic context, the Soviet early warning system known as OKO had recently become operational. OCO was a constellation of satellites equipped with infrared sensors designed to detect the heat signatures of U.S. ICBM and SLBM boosters. The system was new, complex, and still being integrated into the larger Soviet air defense architecture. The assumption was that OCO would provide critical early seconds of warning that radar alone could not. But early software, sensor calibration, and interpretation protocols were not yet fully mature. Complex systems create unintended interactions. This was the operational reality of early 1980s strategic detection. On September 26, 1983, OCO operators observed what appeared to be multiple U.S. missile launches. The system flagged these as high-confidence signals. They matched criteria in the early warning model for an ICBM salvo. Given the low doctrine and the strategic context of mutual suspicion, the alarm was serious. Human operators faced the system's interpretation within a structure that assumed danger until confirmed otherwise. This produced a situation where a false alarm had real operational consequence. Understanding what went wrong and why escalation was avoided requires examining the mechanics of these early warning systems, the doctrines that shaped their use, and the assumptions that guided command responses on both sides. This is where the structural nature of Cold War nuclear risk becomes clear. Danger emerges not only from weapons, but from the interpretive systems that govern their perceived use. The OCO incident cannot be explained by a single sensor error. It must be explained as a system built to reward speed, operating under uncertainty. That is what launch on warning means in practice. Launch on warning is not simply a policy choice. It is a technical and organizational posture. It exists because missile flight times are short. It exists because command nodes are vulnerable. And it exists because both sides fear decapitation. The mechanism is straightforward. Early warning sensors detect a possible launch. The warning system assigns a confidence level. The command chain is notified. Forces are moved toward readiness. Leadership is presented with a shrinking decision window. The system assumes that early warning data is credible enough to justify escalation in posture. The system cannot afford to wait for certainty. In the Soviet Union, this logic was embedded in strategic planning after decades of studying U.S. capabilities. Soviet planners were particularly sensitive to U.S. accuracy improvements and the possibility of a counterforce strike. Counterforce is a targeting strategy aimed at enemy nuclear forces and command systems. If counterforce is credible, it increases pressure on the defender to respond quickly. This is because waiting could mean losing the ability to retaliate. So low was not an irrational posture. It was a structural adaptation to perceived vulnerability. OCO was introduced into this environment as a speed-enhancing sensor layer. Radar detection alone has limits. Radars detect objects once they rise above the horizon. Satellites can detect booster flames earlier. This provides additional minutes of warning. Minutes matter in nuclear doctrine. OCO was therefore an incentive-driven system. It existed because Soviet command needed earlier warning to sustain deterrence. But OCO also introduced a new failure pathway. Satellites interpret infrared patterns. Infrared detection is vulnerable to environmental effects. Cloud cover, sunlight reflections, and atmospheric conditions can create false signatures. A new sensor system is often less reliable during early operational years. This is not speculation. It is a standard feature of complex military technology integration. The Soviet incentive structure amplified this vulnerability. In a launch-on warning system, false negatives are catastrophic. False positives are dangerous but survivable. So the institution prioritizes sensitivity. Sensitivity means lower thresholds for alarm. Lower thresholds mean more false alerts. This is the central trade-off. The Soviet Early Warning Command had procedural incentives aligned with this trade-off. Operators were trained to treat high-confidence alerts as urgent. The system's software and alert protocols were built to produce clear escalatory outputs. This was a deliberate design feature. A warning system that constantly hesitates is useless under low doctrine. So the system was designed to be decisive. But decisiveness is dangerous when the input data is uncertain. This is the first structural risk. The second structural risk is the interface between automation and human judgment. OCO did not order a response. It generated an alert classification. Humans were required to interpret it, but humans were operating under procedural pressure. They were trained that if the system signals a launch, they must escalate rapidly. This creates an institutional bias. Human judgment is constrained by doctrine. The third structural risk is organizational hierarchy. Soviet early warning data moved through a chain that included OCO operators, early warning command officers, Soviet air defense command structures, general staff, and political leadership channels. Each layer is designed to move information upward quickly. The chain exists because the political leadership must be informed early. But each layer also reduces the ability to pause. In high-alert environments, information tends to move faster than verification. The fourth structural risk is context. The system was not operating in a neutral environment. It was operating in 1983. 1983 was the peak year of the late Cold War war scare. Soviet leadership believed the West might attempt strategic surprise. The U.S. was conducting aggressive intelligence operations. NATO deployments and rhetoric were interpreted as escalatory. This increased the prior probability assigned to attack indicators. In statistical terms, context changes the baseline expectation. If baseline expectation is higher, ambiguous signals are interpreted as more credible. That is how strategic fear becomes procedural reality. The final incentive is reputational. Operators and commanders are punished for missing real danger. They are rarely punished for false alarms that are later corrected. This is not personal bias, it is organizational design. So, the Soviet early warning system in 1983 had a predictable structural behavior. It would treat ambiguous sensor signals as potentially real, and it would escalate them quickly. OCO was the sensor. Low was the doctrine, the war scare was the context. Together, they created a system where a false alarm could become a real crisis. To understand the 26 September event itself, we now need to examine how detection and warning operated at the technical level and how the system classified the alarm. OCO was not a general intelligence system. It was a specialized early warning sensor designed for one job: detect U.S. missile launches quickly. This distinction matters. Intelligence systems try to interpret intent. Early warning systems try to detect physical events fast enough to enable response. OCO operated by detecting infrared emissions consistent with missile booster flames. Its satellites observed the U.S. ICBM fields from orbital vantage points. The system compared sensor input against expected launch signatures. The mechanism is pattern recognition. If the system detects a heat signature in the correct geographic zone, with the correct intensity and temporal pattern, it flags a launch. If multiple detections occur in a short window, the system can classify it as a salvo. This is how the warning picture is generated. But infrared detection has an inherent limitation. It does not directly detect missiles. It detects heat. Heat signatures can be produced by other phenomena. Sunlight reflections off cloud tops. Atmospheric scattering. Seasonal lighting angles. These effects are not random. They are predictable under certain conditions. In September 1983, the relevant condition was the geometry of sunlight relative to Earth, clouds, and satellite line of sight. This is the technical vulnerability. OCO's early operational algorithms were still being refined. They were designed to reduce false positives, but they were not perfect. The system's confidence scoring could still be fooled by environmental alignment. On September 26, 1983, the system reportedly registered what looked like a U.S. ICBM launch from Minuteman fields. The system classified the signal as high confidence. Shortly afterward, it flagged additional launches. The warning display now looked like a small-scale U.S. first strike. This detail is strategically important. A massive full-scale strike might look more rational in MAD logic, but a small strike could look like a decapitation attempt. It could be interpreted as the first wave of a larger attack. So even a small number of apparent launches can be destabilizing. This is one reason early warning systems are dangerous. They create pressure from partial data. Once OCO flagged launches, the Soviet early warning command had to cross-check. Cross-checking is the stabilizing mechanism in launch warning systems. The most important cross-check was ground-based radar. If U.S. missiles had launched, they should eventually appear on Soviet radar as they rose into ballistic trajectories. Radar confirmation would take time because of horizon limits. So the warning system had a built-in sequencing problem. Satellites can provide early warning. Radars provide later confirmation. This creates a window of uncertainty. That window is exactly where launch on warning becomes dangerous. During this uncertainty window, the Soviet command had to decide whether to treat the satellite warning as credible enough to escalate readiness. The system could not wait comfortably, because waiting might erase decision time if the warning was real. This is the core structural dilemma. OCO's warning was routed through Soviet command and control channels. Operators at the warning center observed the system's classifications. The system output was not neutral. It was designed to be decisive. The warning likely triggered formal alert protocols. These protocols included notifying higher command elements and preparing for potential escalation. At this stage, intelligence and warning merge. The Soviet leadership did not have time to conduct broad intelligence interpretation. They had to decide whether the physical event was real. This is why early warning is different from intelligence. Intelligence can be slow. Early warning must be fast. The system's assumptions now dominated interpretation. The system assumed U.S. missiles could be launched with little warning. Early detection is essential. Confirmation may arrive too late. False negatives are unacceptable. But the system could not see whether the heat signature was environmental, whether the U.S. command had actually issued launch orders, whether other sensors supported the claim immediately. So, the system produced a high-confidence alert from incomplete information. Human judgment entered at the warning center. Operators and officers had to assess plausibility. They had to decide whether the warning matched the strategic environment. This is where the 1983 war scare mattered. In a high-tension context, the system's alert looked more plausible. But human judgment also had access to a critical counterpoint. Radar confirmation was absent. This created the key stabilizing question. If missiles are truly in flight, why are radars not seeing them yet? The answer could be timing, or it could be that the satellites were wrong. The Soviet warning system now faced its defining test. A satellite system said, launch. Radars had not yet confirmed. Doctrine rewarded speed. Verification demanded patience. This is the structural tension that makes 26 September 1983 historically important. The next step is to identify the failure point more precisely, how the false alarm was produced, how it moved through the command chain, and why it did not trigger escalation. The failure point in the 26th of September 1983 incident was not a single broken sensor. It was a system that treated a plausible-looking signal as a high-confidence launch without immediate independent confirmation. The technical cause is generally understood. OCO's satellites misinterpreted sunlight reflections from high-altitude clouds as missile booster plumes. The geometry of the sun, the Earth's curvature, and the satellite's viewing angle produced an infrared pattern that matched the system's launch template. This is a classic complex system vulnerability. A rare environmental alignment triggers a false positive. But the deeper failure was institutional. The system did not fail because it produced a false alert. Any sensor system will produce errors. The system failed because it produced a false alert in a format designed to drive escalation. The mechanism was the confidence classification. OCO did not simply say, certain anomaly. It reportedly classified the signal as a launch with high confidence. This classification was an output designed for decision-making speed. So the failure point is ambiguous heat to algorithm match to high confidence launch flag. That is a conversion of uncertainty into urgency. The second failure point was sequencing. Satellites detect earlier, radars confirm later. This creates a structural gap where decision-makers must choose whether to act before confirmation. Launch-on warning doctrine exists specifically to exploit that gap. It is designed to allow response before impact. But that means the doctrine institutionalizes decision-making under uncertainty. So the risk is not accidental. It is designed into the system. The third failure point was the interaction between warning output and war scare context. In 1983, Soviet leadership had elevated baseline expectations of Western hostility. This increased the perceived credibility of any warning. This is a structural phenomenon. When baseline expectation rises, false positives become more dangerous. They are less likely to be dismissed. They are more likely to be treated as confirmation of prior fears. So the system's war scare environment amplified the warning output. The fourth failure point was the small strike problem. Oko's warning was not of thousands of missiles. It was of a small number of launches. This matters. A small number of launches could be interpreted as a limited decapitation strike, a first wave before a larger salvo, a test of Soviet response procedures. In a launch-on-warning environment, a small strike can be more destabilizing than a full strike, because it creates uncertainty about intent while still forcing urgent reaction. So the system produced the most dangerous category of warning: partial, plausible, high confidence, but unconfirmed. The fifth failure point was institutional escalation bias. In nuclear warning systems, personnel are trained not to underreact. They are trained that missing a real strike is unacceptable. This produces an organizational posture where warning outputs are escalated rapidly, even if uncertain. The Soviet chain had strong incentives to report upward. This is not because officers wanted war. It is because the institution measures competence by readiness and detection, not by minimizing false alarms. The sixth failure point was limited transparency inside the system itself. Operators could see the satellite warning, but they could not immediately verify the environmental cause. They could not consult meteorological models fast enough to explain the signal. They could not see U.S. command intent. So the warning center was forced to treat the output as operationally meaningful. This is where human judgment became decisive. The incident is often associated with the role of the duty officer at the warning center. But analytically, the key is not heroism. It is the structural fact that the system required a human to decide whether to treat the machine's output as credible. Human judgment intersected with automation at the worst possible moment. The machine produced a high-confidence alert. The doctrine rewarded speed. The context made the alert plausible. But independent radar confirmation was absent. So the system had two competing logics: procedural escalation sensor cross-checking. The structural risk was that escalation would proceed far enough to generate real readiness actions. Those readiness actions could then become observable. If Soviet forces increased alert status, the United States might detect it. If the U.S. detected it, it might adjust its own posture. This could create the same feedback loop seen in other Cold War near-miss cases. This is the critical point. False warning incidents are dangerous, not because they create panic, but because they create real signals. Signals are what adversaries react to. In this case, escalation was avoided, but it was avoided inside a system that was structurally designed to push toward readiness. So the failure point was not only the satellite misread, it was the doctrine technology coupling that translated a sensor anomaly into a credible launch warning. The next question is therefore procedural. Once the warning appeared, what did the Soviet decision chain require? How far did the alert travel? And why did it stop short of escalation? Once Oko classified the event as a launch, the Soviet system moved into its warning workflow. This workflow was designed to ensure speed, but also to prevent unauthorized escalation. The Soviet chain began at the early warning command center. Operators monitored satellite feeds and system classifications. When the alert appeared, the duty officer had to decide whether to transmit it as a confirmed warning up the chain. This is the first decision gate. The system did not automatically launch forces. It produced an alert output. Humans determined whether it was credible enough to report as an attack warning. This distinction is often misunderstood. Launch-on-warning doctrine does not mean automatic launch. It means that the system is designed to prepare for launch based on warning before impact. It still requires procedural confirmation and leadership authorization. The next layer in the Soviet chain involved air defense and strategic command reporting. The warning center's report could move toward the general staff and potentially toward political leadership channels. This is the second gate. Whether higher command is notified in attack mode or in uncertain anomaly mode. The key stabilizing factor was the absence of radar confirmation. Soviet ground-based early warning radars were expected to detect real ICBM trajectories after a short delay. Even with horizon limits, real launches should eventually appear. So the decision chain had a built-in verification mechanism. Satellite early warning must be supported by radar confirmation. In this incident, radar confirmation did not arrive. This forced the system into a procedural contradiction. The satellite said launch, but the radar did not. Under low doctrine, this is the most dangerous zone. If leaders wait too long, they lose time. If they act too soon, they risk escalation on false data. The Soviet decision chain avoided escalation because it treated radar confirmation as the decisive threshold. This is a crucial point. Even under high alert posture, the Soviet system appears to have maintained a final confirmation gate. This gate required multi-source corroboration. So the system did not treat OCO alone as sufficient for launch authorization. This is why escalation was avoided. Human judgment reinforced this gate. The duty officer and senior officers had to interpret the plausibility of the warning. A small number of launches did not fit cleanly with the logic of an all-out U.S. first strike. This does not mean the warning was dismissed casually. It means plausibility analysis was part of the process. A rational U.S. first strike in Soviet planning models would likely be massive. It would target command nodes and strategic forces simultaneously. A handful of missiles looked inconsistent with that model. So the warning center had a conceptual counterweight. The attack scenario did not match expected strike logic. This is the second stabilizer. The third stabilizer was procedural inertia in the highest levels of nuclear authorization. Even if the warning had moved upward, nuclear release required political leadership involvement. The Soviet Union had strict control over nuclear use authorization. This was designed to prevent accidental war. So the system had layered barriers. Duty officer credibility gate, radar confirmation gate, general staff assessment gate, political authorization gate. Escalation was avoided because these gates held. But it is important to note what the system still did. Even if it did not launch, it likely elevated readiness internally. It likely increased attention, communications posture, and monitoring. These actions may not have been visible externally, but they are still part of the risk process. Because readiness changes can create further signals. The incident ended when the warning was recognized as false. This recognition did not come from a single moment. It came from the continued absence of radar confirmation. Time itself became a verification tool. If missiles were real, they would appear. They did not. So the system downgraded the alert. Time was the final stabilizer. In early warning crises, time is double-edged. It compresses decisions, but it also allows confirmation to arrive. Here, the Soviet system relied on the second function. The incident shows a structural truth about launch on warning. The doctrine creates pressure to act early, but in practice, institutions still need confirmation gates to avoid catastrophic error. Those gates reduce responsiveness, but they prevent false launch escalation. So, launch on warning is inherently unstable. If it is too strict, it loses deterrent value. If it is too permissive, it becomes vulnerable to false alarms. The 26 September incident avoided escalation because the Soviet system, despite its sensitivity, retained multi-source verification, plausibility checks, hierarchical authorization barriers, the ability to let time resolve ambiguity. But this is not a reassuring conclusion. It shows that stability depended on multiple gates functioning correctly under maximum pressure. That is fragile stability. There is broad agreement that the 26th of September 1983 incident was one of the most serious false alarms of the Cold War. The Soviet early warning system reported apparent U.S. missile launches. The warning was false. Escalation was avoided through procedural and human gates. The disagreements are about how the incident should be interpreted as a stability case study. One area of disagreement is how far the warning moved up the Soviet chain. Some accounts emphasize that the warning center treated the alert as an internal anomaly and did not report it as a confirmed attack. Other interpretations suggest the event was reported upward in some form. but framed as uncertain. This matters because it changes the assessed proximity to political-level crisis decision-making. But the evidence remains incomplete. Soviet archival access is limited. Much of what is known comes from later interviews, memoirs, and partial documentary releases. So historians disagree partly because the documentary record is uneven. A second disagreement concerns procedural doctrine at the time. How strictly did the Soviet Union adhere to launch-on warning? Was LOW an operational plan with clear trigger thresholds? Or was it a general posture that still required multiple confirmation layers? Most serious scholarship supports the second interpretation. Even highly sensitive systems tend to preserve multi-source confirmation gates, but the degree of required confirmation is contested. This debate is not academic. It determines how dangerous the system truly was. If OCO alone could trigger escalation, the system was near automatic. If radar confirmation was required, the system was still dangerous but less likely to produce accidental war. A third disagreement concerns the human factor. Popular retellings often frame the incident as a single individual preventing nuclear war. Historians are more cautious. The incident was not resolved by intuition alone. It was resolved by the structural absence of radar confirmation over time. Human judgment mattered, but it mattered inside a system with verification gates. So the disagreement is about emphasis. Was this primarily a heroic human intervention, or was it primarily a case of institutional redundancy functioning under stress? The strongest analytic interpretation is that both mattered, but the system design mattered more. A fourth disagreement concerns whether the Soviet leadership in 1983 was genuinely preparing for imminent war. Some historians argue Soviet leadership was deeply fearful and that war scare logic had reached unusually high levels. Others argue that, while suspicion was elevated, the Soviet system remained fundamentally defensive and not poised for first use. This matters because it changes how the false alarm would have been interpreted at higher levels. A leadership expecting imminent war is more likely to treat ambiguous warning as credible. A leadership expecting tension, but not war, is more likely to demand confirmation. The available evidence suggests heightened fear existed, but the exact level of readiness and belief remains debated. A fifth disagreement concerns what the incident proves about MAD and deterrent stability. MAD assumes rational actors will avoid nuclear war because the costs are unacceptable. The 26th September incident shows that the most dangerous pathway is not deliberate initiation. It is system-generated crisis behavior from false perception. This is a different kind of risk. It is not about intent. It is about information processing under time pressure. The incident proves several structural lessons. First, early warning systems are inherently interpretive. They do not observe attack. They observe proxy signals and classify them. Second, launch-on warning doctrine institutionalizes uncertainty. It creates a situation where leaders must act before a confirmation because waiting could remove retaliatory options. Third, the introduction of new technology increases risk during integration periods. OCO was relatively new. New systems have calibration problems, algorithmic blind spots, and environmental vulnerabilities. Fourth, redundancy is necessary but not sufficient. Redundancy prevented escalation here, but redundancy also requires time. Time is exactly what launch-on warning compresses. Fifth, Cold War stability was not a stable equilibrium. It was a continuous avoidance of feedback loops. The system could have failed if radar confirmation had been delayed longer. The satellite system had flagged a larger salvo. Leadership belief in imminent attack had been higher. Readiness actions had been externally observed and misread. None of these require irrationality. They require only normal system behavior under stress. The 26th of September 1983 incident therefore demonstrates the limits of launch-on warning. LOW is designed to preserve deterrence under vulnerability, but it creates a structural risk of catastrophic escalation from false data. This is the paradox of late Cold War nuclear competition. The more both sides tried to reduce surprise through speed, the more they increased the probability of crisis through misinterpretation. In that sense, the incident is not a historical anomaly. It is a predictable outcome of the doctrine-technology coupling that defined the nuclear age.